Hi guys, welcome back to the Astro Imaging Channel. Tonight's session is an open discussion, so anything, any specific topics you have to ask, you can ask in our chat. Go on our website, it'll be bouncing on the bottom right. Just click that and you'll be in our chat. The one thing I do want to show off before that is we have done a lot of shows on this. Why is that not working? Hold on, I have to click a box. We've done a lot of shows on the Astro Imaging Channel. And you can see them all on our website, but actually one of the better ways to see them is probably just by going to our page on YouTube, which you can see right here. Basically, you type the Astro Imaging Channel right up there on YouTube, and you can click here, and it will show you all of our past shows. This is odd, it's not coming up the same way. Well, it'll show you all of our past shows with the description right next to them. Of course, on our website, you don't get the full description, so you kind of are stuck with what it is we were titling it as. But if you do want to go back and check it out, this is a great way to do it. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I've been asked a few questions in the past few weeks specifically about shows that we've done in the past. Popular one, Flat Fielding. We had discussed the Prima Lucha Labs mini computer that we had talked about a bit last week. We have a lot of great content, and it might be a little bit more difficult to get to it from our website. You can search for it in Google or on YouTube, but sometimes it's hard to figure out what it is you're searching for. So I definitely suggest browsing this. There is a lot of good stuff, and some of our early stuff really covered the basics very well. So, of course, you can find us there. At the same time, you can subscribe to us, which will just kind of give you notifications whenever we post a new show. So that's that. That's what I wanted to show off this week. I am going to take my screen back because I did ask in chat before the show started for a few potential topics. One came in email. I'm going to cover that in a few seconds. I invite all the people inside the room to comment on it. But the one that I see in chat right now is questions about collimation. Glenn has an SCT. He knows RC and Dobbs are collimated. Do any need to be collimated more often than another? In my own estimation, I'm going to say that Dobbs will need to be collimated most often. It's more inherent to the design. Well, I should say the collapsible Dobbs or the lightweights or the ones that basically fold up into a backpack. All of those are going to need to be collimated when you go out, but they're mostly visual instruments. Things like the 8-inch Orion, if you're putting it in your garage, taking it out, the tube style Dobbs may not need to be collimated as often. But again, they're visual instruments. SCTs and RCs, they are on par in regards to how often they're going to need to be collimated, but it's worth noting that an SCT is much, much, much easier to collimate than an RC. An SCT is basically one mirror that has to be collimated, the secondary mirror, and you collimate it from the front. You can use a screwdriver, you can buy Bob's knobs, but collimating an SCT, you can learn how to do it in 15 minutes, and you can collimate it in, I don't know, like a minute and a half, literally. And that's visually. Actually, collimating the image, for me, always took a little bit longer because I was more going back and forth from the collimation knobs to the screen. But in that case, I was usually using some sort of tool. SCTs are so easy to collimate that in the end, I ended up doing it almost purely visually. RCs, the collimation process is a bit more difficult. It's I don't want to say it's a two-step process, but you're collimating two mirrors, and you have to collimate them iteratively, which means you have to go back and forth collimating let me think, the secondary first, then the primary. Well, I guess it depends on your routine. With an RC, you almost certainly are going to need an additional tool to collimate it. I used a laser collimator. Some people use a collimating sight tube. But even after using one of those initial methods, I move on to the deep sky instruments method, which uses basically, I believe, you take looping images, slightly defocused, and you want to make sure that all of the stars align radially. And once basically the radial elongation is even all around, you're basically in collimation. But like I said, it is an iterative process, so you're going to go back and forth a few times and eventually get to that point where you're ready for the radial test. And that is, in my opinion, the most accurate way that you could do it. And not the easiest. RCs are difficult to collimate, but when you do get them collimated, well, it's a lot like having an SCT, only much faster and a little bit better performance in general.
So the mechanical stability of the OTA will determine how often something will, any reflector, how often it has to be collimated. The mirror shapes and the speed of the optics will determine how hard it is. The longer the F ratio, the bigger the F ratio, the less complex the mirror shapes, they're easier to collimate. Like an SCT F10 with spherical mirrors is very easy to collimate versus a two complex mirrors on an RC, because not only you have to be pointing towards each other, but the mirror has an optical axis too. It's not a sphere. So as you add to it, it gets more and more complicated. And then you get into these really complicated systems like Ricardi-Honder's, that type of dual mirror systems that are like F3. Now you're in a different kind of a ball game on how to collimate those. Those are even harder than RCs.
Yes. Thanks, Tolga.
I wanted to say that I'm a regular visual observer, and I collimate my whatever DOB I'm using, either 16 or 12.5, depending on where I am. I collimate that every time I go out. My SCT, I haven't collimated. It's like every year or so, it looks like I go and collimate it. I've had an RC sitting back here. I think it's behind me, as a matter of fact. Let me see if I can turn my back. And it's been in collimation the whole time, as far as I know. There it is back there. Hi. And I've never had an issue with wondering if it's collimated or not. It came out of the box like that. It's been fine. I don't know what will happen when I do have to collimate it, but I'll worry about that when it happens. I'm out.
So Glenn's saying he started collimating his C8 with a flattener reducer and DSLR using Backyard EOS. Saw that if he wasn't in the center of the screen showing a star defocused, anywhere he put the star was out of collimation in that direction. Is that normal, or is the flattener not working correct? Knows the image is curved and the camera is taking a flat image, but assumed it would be closer than it is. So if you're defocused and the star is not in the center of the field, then I think you might see some elongation. It might come down to, first of all, one clarification: you're using a flattener, reducer, and a DSLR. Two pieces of glass or the flattener reducer. I just want to make sure that you're not using like two separate things that might not be compatible, because that could cause an issue. But if it's just the flattener reducer, then I think by putting the star out of the center, it'll appear out of collimation, or it will not be a perfect circle. That will depend on how out of focus it is. So you should always collimate with the star in the center. I just want to scan down and see one piece of glass. Yeah, so I think that's normal. Get the star in the center, defocus it, make sure that the donut basically is the same all the way around. Keep tightening up the focus. Make the donut smaller and smaller and smaller. Make sure it stays basically the same all around. Keep getting it tighter and tighter and tighter. Bring it to focus. When you are in focus, when you're in focus on a day of good seeing, you should be able to collimate just based on that star. You might not be able to do it every night, but the more you look, the more you try, the more you're going to get that feeling. And I was never 100% confident at any point that I was like collimating perfectly until that point where I just went out and collimated it and said, oh, that's not so hard. I'm in perfect collimation. And there we go.
I'll give you a little tip on collimation. So sometimes it's hard to figure out which way to go. It's hard to figure out which screw does what. So what you do with that is that you take you defocus the star, and as you're looking at the screen, you take a ruler or a pencil, and you go from the collimation screw straight out to the edge of the telescope, and that whatever you put in front of the telescope is going to leave a shadow on the star. You're going to see the shadow of that ruler or pencil on your screen, and that will give you an orientation of, okay, this screw on the bottom left will move it this way. You still don't know which way to turn, but at least you know direction which screw you need to move.
Sometimes I just stick my finger.
Well, we'll probably draw that out.
Sometimes I just stick my finger like right in the.
Right, exactly. You could just put your arm across it. Exactly. It doesn't.
Okay. Last week we had Gisem on, who produces the Stellar Mate. Sounds great on paper, but what kind of shelf life with the evolution of Raspberry Pi, specifically the USB 3.0 issue? So I'm not 100% sure what the USB 3.0 issue is, but what I will say is one of the things Gisem pointed out last week was he used it. He chose the Pi platform not because it was the 100% most industrial bulletproof platform you could have out there, but in part because the parts are cheap and could be relatively easily replaced. Sometimes in these conditions, the conditions we're using this stuff at, you're going to want a piece of gear that you can just replace very easily if something goes wrong. That said, I believe he said he hasn't had any issues because of typical use or many issues because of typical use. But keep that in mind. The benefit of the Raspberry Pi isn't its waterproofing or its industrial ability. It's because it's cheap and easy to replace. And you can, as he said, if you have one, download the disk image and load it onto your Pi that you picked up at the hardware store or on Amazon for that matter. Any best strategies for imaging and processing nebula with very bright centers and faint edges? So let me think about that. Basically, I'm going to give you the rule number one. You've got to put the time in. The bright center is going to be deceiving. You're going to process your first night or your first few hours of data. The center's going to be you're going to put the temporary stretch on it. The center's going to be really bright, and it's going to fall off towards the edges, and the dimmer edges are going to be slightly noisy. What you've got to do is you got to make sure your exposure time is enough for those faint edges, because you want to get them relatively noise-free right off the bat. The less noise reduction you have to do on the image, the better. So basically, determine your exposure length for the faint edges. And then when it comes to processing the nebula, I'm going to say use a tool basically that's going to allow you to dim the center of the nebula and reveal a bit more of the internal structures that are most likely blown out. In PixInsight, we would use, see, it's going to take me a little bit of time to load it, but I'm going to try and quickly think if I can demonstrate anything. I'm going to do this on the fly. Yep.
There's a couple things to consider. The first thing is if it's a reflection nebula, that issue is completely different than if it's an emission nebula. On a reflection nebula, you got to treat it, and you have to worry about blown out stars. But in a emission nebula, with maybe one exception I can think of, you should probably make your exposures as long as you can reasonably do it according to your guiding, whether that be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 30 minutes, because blown out stars are very, very seldom an issue. And for sulfur and oxygen, there's only one nebula I can think of there, planetary, where you actually have to worry about overexposing it. Now, with reflection nebula, you have to treat those just like RGB images. And you have the same issues of overexposing stars and blowing them out. And in that case, you probably want to have shorter exposures to bring out the core, and then longer exposures to get some of the edges. And even in that case, you probably can use your HA on the reflection nebula to bring out some detail, because most of those, not all of them, most of them have an HA component which can help you with your detail.
Good points. Yes. Did I happen to pick a good image here? We'll see. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, that will work. Let me share my screen. This is, yeah, as Eric mentioned, treatment of reflection and emission nebula will be slightly different. So this is, well, not technically an emission nebula, but a supernova remnant, but basically the same thing emitting H alpha, and this is an H alpha image. So with this particular target, when I'm processing this, and I know you said you're probably thinking something more like the Orion Nebula, but the important thing to do is to reveal the internal structure and some of the stuff that's blown out. So what I want to quickly do, I feel like I'm jumping down the rabbit hole here, so I'm not going to make this look good. I'm just going to demonstrate my point.
Adam, even in that case, I doubt if you've maxed out your CCD. I don't think you're over 65,000 on an HA image. But your processing will have to take care of bringing out the fainter structures versus the brighter structures. That's a processing issue as opposed to how long you take the exposure to make sure you're not blowing out the nebula itself.
Mm-hmm. Feel like I'm doing something wrong here. Is that what I'm doing?
And M1 is not necessarily your typical nebula.
No, I know. What the heck? I don't know. I'm struggling here. What the heck? I feel like my computer's possessed. This is all I'm trying to do here. Okay. It's not going to look great, but it's going to help me demonstrate the point. The first thing I would do is I would actually probably mask off the bright nebula without the stars. So I would basically, I might be inclined to just do a blurring or a convolution on this to get the brightest parts to show up in the mask. That I think I could demonstrate quickly. We have some time, so I might as well take my time with this. Sorry if I wasn't planning on doing this, so I'm sorry if this seems to go a little bit slow. I'm basically just going to take a convolution on a copy of the image. I am going to make it really, really blurry. I barely have to pay any attention to this. Can do that. Apply it. What I want to do on this now is take the background down. Just like that. I'm going to apply it to the image there. So I can do that so I could see the mask might expand over it a little bit. I could actually, if I want to fix that, where did I hide my mask? Right here. I should be able to just dim it a little bit more. Oops. Like that. Reduces the mask a little bit more. I'm not so concerned with that. But then what I would do is I would use HDR multi-scale transform. I can try it at 6 layers. The fewer layers is going to make the detail seem a little bit sharper, but possibly unnatural on planetary nebula. I like to do a low number of layers. I have a feeling on this one that I'm not going to need to do that. I'm going to apply it to the lightness. We can put a lightness mask on it to get a little more protection of that. And let me hide my mask so we can see what happens here. I apply it. And I hope you could see what happened there. Basically, it just took all that brightness that's in the center that seemed to be kind of distracting from the internal structure, and it toned it down. So after doing this, what I would end up doing is I would do another, I would do a curves, because this got a little bit dimmer. So let's find out where mid-tone on this hits. The mid-tone right there hits right there. Let's go a little bit dimmer right there. That spot right there. I'm going to put a lock right there. I'm going to brighten everything above it and dim everything below it. See what the sample or what the preview looks like. What I did do is I am, that mask's still on there? Mask is still on there, that's odd. But when I apply that, it allows me to brighten it back up a little bit, reveals a little bit more of the internal structure. If you are talking about a nebula that has much dimmer structure around the outer edges, then that'd be that you do the same exact thing. You're just kind of basically trying to bring out that internal structure so that you could stretch the outside without blowing this out. Another tool, local histogram equalization, kind of gives you the same type of effect. You pick the scale via the kernel radius. The contrast limit also gives you a little bit more control over it. I tend to do a few passes starting. I think my typical formula is bring the amount way down, like 10% is good. Let's do what I believe would be my normal pass. We'll see what happens. At least star mask this. Oh, this is going to take a while. I forgot. I would do a pass, kernel radius 64, amount 10%, 28. May drop the contrast limit to 1.5, and then 256, and drop the contrast limit to 1, all at lower amounts. If at any point it looks like it's not applying enough of it, I would go back and increase the amount slightly. If it was too much, I'd do the opposite, decrease the amount. But that's one other tool that gives you a little bit of control. As it finishes up here, we'll see if it gives me results I like.
Adam, was the question how long should exposures be on nebula? Was that the question?
I will answer that in 1 second. Let me toggle this back and forth. I can only slightly see a difference. I don't think you're going to be able to see it, but it did basically the same thing that the local histogram, that the HDR multiscale transform did, possibly with just a little bit more slight, probably because I did it in the second pass. But two tools that do very similar things. If you are using a reflection nebula, like the Iris Nebula, this particular tool works wonders. I think, I'm trying to think of another nebula. Any sort of reflection nebula that has a lot of really flowing gas that you really want to make look like a flowing curtain, this tool works wonders on that. Okay, out of the rabbit hole. Oops. Let me pop back over, take my screen back. When using a reducer flattener on an Edge HD scope, does the flattener portion then overcorrect the already flat field, resulting in oblong stars at the edge? You know, I was thinking that, and I'm not quite sure. John's saying it doesn't create coma, but with the field reducer, it doesn't. Okay, there you go. Of course, the typical SCT, you will see that on there. I'm looking for that question, Eric.
Well, I have some examples up here, which, if it is a matter of how long you should expose, I think we'll answer it.
I don't see the question, but is it just how long should you expose for nebula? Is that question in our chat? Because I don't see it at all. Okay, so how long should you expose for nebula? I'm just going to take that question. Please elaborate or give me or just say, oh no, you're running down the wrong path. So as Eric pointed out, there are different types of nebula. There's reflection nebula and emission nebula. There are technically more types of nebula, but let's just treat the two. Let's treat each as just the two basic types.
Adam, I have a couple examples up here.
Okay, I don't see them on your. Do you want to share the screen? There you go. Now I see them.
Okay, so I have 3 examples up here. 2 are emission nebula, the tulip and the butterfly, and then down here is the Iris Nebula. So with the emission nebula, those are 15-minute exposures on an f3.8 Honder scope. And you can see from the histogram, if I just pop it back there, that all the data is really way down to the left. It's very dim. I could have run this for 30 minutes. I just prefer to have more subs rather than have fewer subs. and to prevent loss of subs due to meteors or airplanes or whatever else is going on. So there really is no limit as to how long I could expose it, and nothing about this nebula is blown out. So I've done the auto stretch, but if I turn off the auto stretch on these things, you see basically nothing. The third one here is the iris. And again, when you turn off the auto stretch, the only bright thing here is that core. And you may want to shorten down the exposure a little bit in order to get the core of the iris. And this is a 10-minute exposure, and this is luminosity. So there's lots of data here, but if you come and look at the histogram, you're still not seeing a whole lot of data. It's still off to the left, except for this nice, bright little core, which you see is blown out. So if you wanted to get detail of the core of the Iris Nebula, you would have to shorten the exposures. But as far as the rest of the nebula, that you're very unlikely to blow out any of the other parts of it. And even most of the stars around here are not very bright, and you can process them if a couple of them have to be blown out. So I think with emission nebula, you can't have too long an exposure. The main issue is with emission nebula, you want to have a long exposure and enough exposures in order to get the noise down so you can bring out the detail. With reflection nebula, it's only the core of those reflection nebulas, in this case the iris, which is pretty bright, that you really have to worry about, and then have shorter and longer exposures to bring out that detail in the core.
And one of the things that kind of goes unsaid is a lot of us, if we're shooting emission nebula, are going to be using narrowband. So the narrowband is going to cut out any light pollution. So for those of us who are shooting narrowband from a light polluted site, our exposures, even with those narrowband filters, might be 30 minutes. But if we were trying the impossible and shooting a reflection nebula from a light polluted site, which is going to be very, very difficult, we're still going to be stuck to those 3 to 5 minute exposures. So if you go out to darker skies and you're shooting a reflection nebula, you can push the exposures up to help pull out some of that darker dust and just get a little bit more signal in the exposure.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. The emission nebulas, the two that are shown here on top, those are hydrogen alpha exposures, and that's the brightest of the 3 filters that you use for narrowband. The iris is luminosity, and that's the brightest of the 3, and those are the 10-minute exposures.
Nicole Suther, what is the capture software for the Raspberry Pi? Last week we had Jasem Mutlak on. He is a developer of the StellarMate, and they use EKOS, Indy, and what is the, I forget the other, K-Stars. It's basically installed on the Raspberry Pi, and it allows you to basically do full automation. He's done 2 episodes with us. Both are worth checking out if it seems interesting. Actually, the one he did, I'm going to say about a year ago, he really went into the full capabilities of the device. Actually, the capture software and the device. So it's worth looking. So how is it possible to claim that it works with all types of mounts? I'm not 100% sure it works with all types of mounts, but I think that he mentioned, I do believe he mentioned EQ mod. he did say that if you're interested in an unsupported device, contact him, because sometimes the communication software can be written relatively quickly, and if it's a popular device, he wants to have it written. But that might be something that you want to reach out to him and ask.
I mean, all the common ones that we hear about. I mean, if you have something that came out a month ago, it may not be supported. But everything that we know of, like Celestrons and Iaptrons and Astrophysics software BISC, they're all supported. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I did get one question via email about observatories, and we had done a show a while back about observatories. I actually went through kind of a walkthrough of building my observatories, what went into the decision to design the particular type that I did. And of course, one of the comments I got was, oh, he's a little bit biased towards roll-off roof observatories. Well, I will admit I am biased towards roll-off roof observatories, and that's why I built one. I prefer them. But that's not to say it's the best type of observatory. But let me just tell you a little bit of my thought about a roll-off roof. First of all, it doesn't look like an observatory. It looks like a shed or it doesn't attract a lot of attention, which I guess is what I want to say. So in my case, I think that's good because I didn't want people seeing an observatory or seeing that dome that basically everyone recognizes. Partially for theft, partially for, well, basically whatever can happen. Number two, I built my roof with lumber. I wouldn't be able to build a dome. I built my whole observatory with lumber. I wouldn't be able to build a dome. I'd have to buy one. And when it came down to it, basically they cost more than just building it yourself. The roll-off roof, I was able to buy the parts, even the most difficult parts, the industrial V-channel wheels that hold the roof. I was able to get them on Amazon. The only thing I had to have fabricated was an inverted angle iron that I put on a flat piece of steel, and the V-channel wheels roll on that. So basically I had a roof that rolled on and off that went right on top. But building a shed like that was more comfortable for me than bringing in a observatory. The disadvantage is if I ever move, then I have to leave the shed here. Whereas if I had some sort of fiberglass observatory, I might be able to move that. The other thing I like about the shed is when I open the roof, my gear cools down in a matter of seconds. Basically on a cold night, open the roof, it's cooled down. The mirror might need to cool down a little bit, but it's in an observatory, in a dome observatory, the sun beating down on it all day. Sometimes you have to have that slit open for a little while before it cools down, or get some sort of additional fan. The other thing is to automate a roll-off roof observatory, you can use a garage door opener. To automate a dome, you actually have to have something that's running. Well, you have to have a smart device. It has to know. It has to rotate the dome. It has to know about the pier flip. But that also becomes one of the benefits of the dome. There's less exposure to the sky, so not as much dust is falling inside. There are benefits and disadvantages to each. I just gave you the bias towards roll-off roof example. Anyone else in the room have any comments, thoughts on that? Because, like I said, I am admittedly biased. If
But I had a dome. I still have a dome. It was the cheaper one. It was that next dome. It's plastic. So it was fairly cheap to buy, but with the automation, with the motors and everything, it was still that brought the price up a little bit. But if I at this point, I would probably build if I could, I would build a roll-off roof. But I didn't have a choice. I needed something temporary that could have been taken down. So in my case, the dome made sense, unlike your case. But if I had a choice, if it was my backyard, I would do the same thing, exactly what you did, because you can't tell it's a dome. It looks just like a shed. There's no automation. You don't have to worry about the shutter and dome geometry and how far do you have to offset the pier from the center of the. There are all these calculations. It's not just like we just don't put it and forget it. Yeah, it's a lot easier to do a roll-off roof and to use it.
Yeah. Now Terry's going to disagree with me on the cool down times. I wish we had an advocate for domes in the room because there are a number of scenarios where they really will work a lot better. Now I'm assuming this is Terry that we had on last week, who did buy a very, very nice, basically premium dome, but he has a very remote setup that almost demands what I'll say is a bulletproof system. Yeah, and he's
one advantage is wind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because you're just completely your telescope is inside of a shell. That's a huge advantage.
Yep. And if you're in the desert, a dome will keep it slightly cleaner inside. There are a number of advantages for a dome. The disadvantage, the biggest disadvantage in my mind is complexity. And the complexity can be overcome at a price, and then you have a better system if you're willing to deal with that complexity. We do it every day with every piece of our gear. Sometimes we're willing to sacrifice complexity for ease of use, and sometimes we want that complexity for an additional particular protection that we're getting. Domes take up less space than a shed, better protection from stray light, less dew. Yeah.
Another advantage to a roll-off is that you could put more than one pier inside one.
Mm-hmm.
And one roof, and domes are usually like they're a single telescope kind of,
Yep.
Because there's one opening. Even if you get a dome big enough to get two piers in it, you need like a clamshell kind of a dome, not a rotating dome.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you got to point out also is that Adam hinted at this when he said that a roll-off dome looks like a shed, and that gets you by a whole lot of ordinances and codes, covenants, and restrictions and things like that. It's just a garden shed out in the backyard, and so that's an advantage. And some people don't like advertising, maybe that they've got expensive equipment around, and may think that putting up an observatory would be advertising some expensive stuff. Although I'm not sure that's a real telling argument. It's just that I know that if we were to start putting up a whole lot of observatories out here with the domes and things like that, we might start having code problems because the codes are different for observatories than they are for garden sheds.
Yep. So Chow's asking how to determine how many subs in each narrowband channel 33% H alpha, 33% O3, 33% S2 to make up a good image, or it depends on the target, particularly for narrowband. So I'm going to say it really depends on the target, but I'll give you a few kind of tips for what I would do. You have to have a strong H alpha image. The H alpha is going to be your, basically is going to be for most targets, your luminance image, where you're getting all of the detail and all of that structure from. There may be some targets where you're going to get some of it from O3. If it's very strong in O3, something like the Crescent Nebula, you're going to get a little bit of that outer shell in O3. For the Dumbbell Nebula, you're going to be planetary nebulas as well. For the Dumbbell Nebula, you're going to have that outer dumbbell shell kind of expanding out in O3. For those particular targets, you might choose to do strong H alpha, strong O3. But for the larger portion of targets, I'm going to say get a lot of strength in H alpha and treat your O3 and S2 somewhat like you would RGB imaging. Basically, it's not that important. You've got to get enough of it to give you some color when you do the color combine, but you're going to end up blurring the O3 and the S2. You are going to get almost all of the detail from the H alpha, and the O3 and S2 are just going to give you a little bit of color. Yes.
I have a couple comments about that.
Go right ahead.
You're right. You're getting, in most cases, in most emission nebula, not necessarily in planetaries, you're going to go for as much HA as is going to give you that detail. But the question is, how much HA do you get? So the way that I judge that is I keep on accumulating HA data, say 1 night or 2 night or 3 night, and then do the initial processing and see when there's a plateau of the signal to noise ratio. And when you get to that point where no more additional HA data is going to significantly affect your SNR of the processed image, of the sum of all them, then you've reached that point. Now that's not something that everyone can do. Maybe you get 1 good night of HA and then that's it and you make your image. In that case, that would be your answer. But if you're really going for as much detail on those emission nebulae as possible, keep on accumulating and processing and summing the data till that SNR curve seems to plateau off or is not increasing very much. Now for the sulfur and oxygen, you're right, you don't need much detail. So I bin those 2-2. So bin 2, and you have 1 good night of each of them is probably going to give you enough data to make a good Hubble palette image with almost no exception on that. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to those exceptions, and that is if you get something like the Rosette, I wouldn't bin the sulfur and oxygen because they give enough detail that you want that detail to carry over in your final image. The same thing probably applies to the Heart Nebula, but in most of them, I would bin sulfur and oxygen bin 2 and get 1 good night of each.
And you know, it's funny you say that because with a planet, this is going to touch on 2 topics we came up with. With a planetary nebula, like the Dumbbell Nebula, for example, the O3 shell that expands it, that's kind of a challenge to get. And a lot of us really have taken that on and I think done a great job pulling that out. But that might be an example of where you're going to bin just so you get the sensitivity. You're binning for the benefit of pulling out more. Whereas I think for some other emission nebula in the O3 and S2, you're binning just to save time. You don't really care so much about it. Whereas for a planetary, you might be binning to really pull that detail or pull that detail out, and at the same time, rather than poo-pooing the data and saying 4 hours will do, I can make that do, You might be shooting 15 hours of Bind 03 to really get that strong stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff up there in 03, but it takes a ton of time to pull it out.
Yeah, the other thing to consider is that I'm assuming that we talked about narrow band, that we're doing something like Hubble palette images using tone mapping. And in that case, if you have a fairly coarse O3 or sulfur, you're taking out the stars, you're blurring the image, and then you're producing a tone map. And in that case, having a lot of O3 or sulfur really is not going to make a whole lot of difference in your final image. And as you said, your HA plus a little bit of contribution of sulfur and oxygen is going to be your luminosity for a tone map. And those are the nice, the green, orange, purple images that we all kind of like.
Expand the question. How do we tell whether we should use narrowband versus LRGB or a combo for a target? So let me first say this. I shoot narrowband because I really can't shoot much LRGB from where I live. My light pollution is too bad that I cannot get the quality of LRGB image I want from where I live. If I want a good LRGB image, I drive my gear out of town and shoot from somewhere else. So how do I tell whether I should use narrowband versus LRGB? Basically, if it's in season, I'm shooting narrowband, and when the LRGB filter's in there, I'm going to try and shoot bright targets or something that can kind of get me by. But for the most part, I almost always have the narrowband filters in.
Adam, you want me to tackle this one again?
Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I shoot both narrowband and RGB images. So there are different classes of targets where you might have different considerations. If you're shooting simply an emission nebula, like say the Tulip, you shoot your narrowband filters, and then you might shoot your RGB at the same or after you're done with that. But I can tell you that when you're done, that object is going to be red. The object is going to be red. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. And so the consideration of shooting RGB is just to get an additional image. Now, in the case of a reflection nebula that has an HA component, it is really worthwhile to shoot both the narrowband for hydrogen alpha and then the RGB, because the hydrogen alpha can contribute a lot of detail to that reflection emission nebula, and you can only get it by doing the 3 RGB or luminosity if you want to do that as well, along with the hydrogen alpha. But emission nebulas are red, and unless you want to try to get in colored stars, which to me don't look good with Hubble palette images, then there's really no need to shoot RGB unless you want a red image. You can look at emission nebula shot in RGB, and you'll see they're red.
Can I pitch
Jump right in.
this? I'm not at home and I don't have access to all the questions and stuff, but I understand that the question is, when would you shoot narrowband versus LRGB? And there's one very obvious thing that both we both talked about already, and that is the target selection. There are certain targets that are not made for narrowband. For instance, all your galaxies, they're full spectrum light, and you need full spectrum light. You can take the narrow bands if you want, but they're full spectrum, and you're going to want the R and the G and the B in there. So that's why during the spring, it's galaxy season, and we just basically put our narrow bands away for a while. There just aren't that many targets for a while. And that certainly has something to do with it. For those of you who are wondering, should I buy an LRGB set, or should I buy a narrowband set of filters to go with my LRGB set? Yeah, sure. Particularly if you're imaging from home and you've got light pollution. But for an awful lot of targets, you're just not going to get anything much out of the narrowband targets or narrowband filters.
Let me add one caveat to that, Alex. If you're shooting galaxies, it's worthwhile to have a hydrogen alpha filter to shoot that galaxy, because you will light up all the emission nebulas in
Yes,
say
yes,
M101 or as long as the galaxy is some reasonable size and you can get some detail, it's going to have emission nebula, and taking one night to shoot hydrogen alpha to light those up a little bit is really going to enhance that kind of image. And that's assuming that, of course, you can shoot RGB. So your at the minimum, if you're not interested in emission nebula, your filter selection should be LRGB and then H for hydrogen alpha.
Mhm.
And Terry's actually making that same comment using H alpha in all galaxy shots. It's funny when you said that, I immediately thought to myself, well, you know, that's kind of an advanced technique, but it's probably one of those things that for an Andromeda, for an M51, for any of those really photogenic galaxies,
M101 and M81, 82, any galaxy of any size. You look at any galaxy image which you really like, and you are looking not only in the structure, but you're looking at those little red things popping out of it. And that's a hydrogen alpha filter. And it's hard to get that out without having a hydrogen alpha filter as part of your assembly of filters.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's no reason to use hydrogen alpha on those. I'm just saying that there's some targets that just don't lend themselves to narrowbanding.
Mm-hmm. No, and if you only had, you wouldn't shoot a galaxy in narrowband. You would shoot H alpha of the galaxy to get little emission nebula that's like little speckles of emission nebula that when you first sharpen and then add to the galaxy image in the red channel, it just pops. And it even Terry's sharing an image. I'm coming from Terry. I am sure. Yes, let's show this off. Let me show this off to those of you. Oops. I'm sorry, I have a million screens open as always, because this is a great example. You can see the way down here, the H alpha, it just gives you one more color palette to blend in there. And the way, I don't know, this particular image is just basically amazing. The way the dark dust and the H alpha and the brighter just core of the galaxy works. Even the, I'm sure the H alpha is contributing to the core here where these just kind of jets are popping off what looks like the core of the galaxy. You can take an exceptional image and make it just breathtaking by adding a little bit of H alpha into it. The other thing, one of the other things that actually happens is, I believe, because of the wavelength of H alpha, it is slightly less impacted by seeing, whereas a broadband will be slightly more impacted by seeing. So it should allow you to sharpen just that particular channel a little bit more, just a little bit more. But
well, again, my comment on that would be, if you're shooting a galaxy like this, your RGBs will have nice broad histograms with whatever data you shoot. When you shoot the hydrogen alpha, that's not the case. Those will be noisy little bits of information that you'll have to process and then change the histogram so you're only bringing out those really bright parts of the galaxy. You're never going to have much detail per se to add to it. You're just going to enhance that red channel, just like the image that we just saw.
Yep. Yeah, if you haven't done it, it's definitely worth trying. Now, I do want to jump back to a question. I've got 10:30 right now, so I'm going to hit one more question before we call it a night. Someone is asking about, they have a ZWO 294 color camera. Would I be wasting my money buying a filter wheel, H alpha 03 S2 filters? In short, yes. you're going to see very little benefit using H-alpha O3 filter, S2O3 filters on your camera. Later on, you said, I don't remember how you phrased it, you weren't quite happy with the 284, but you think it might just be your level of knowledge. Well, one of the things I will say is, for narrowband in particular, the difference between a one-shot color and a monochromatic camera with filters is night and day. No comparison. The monochromatic just blows it away. So had I known the difference earlier on, I just would have made that jump much, much earlier on. It almost made me question that initial best piece of advice everyone gets. Oh, the most important thing is the mount. Well, I had a good mount, but I got this camera and I thought to myself, wow, maybe I should have got this camera a long time ago, even before I got the mount. Because a good monochromatic camera, if you're shooting lots of narrowband, really makes it pop.
For me, I would shoot LRGB every time if I could. So for me my thing to choose is by light pollution or for the moon. If there's moon out, I'll shoot narrowband. But if it's a new moon night on a dark sky, I'm shooting LRGB. I don't care. On a new moon night, if I'm in New Mexico or somewhere really dark, I'm shooting LRGB. I'm not wasting my time with narrowband.
You know, we say it depends on the target. It almost primarily depends on your location, or your equipment's location, I should say. Because Tolga was saying that, and I thought to myself, "Oh, that's interesting. He's got similar skies to me, but no, he's got New Mexico too." So, and Eric, for example, has a remote setup as well. I'm the unlucky one that's stuck using narrowband filters, but hey, I like narrowband. So I said the last one was the last question. I'm going to try and hit this one really quickly. How do you get a smooth black background in your imaging, in your images? By getting more exposure time or getting more subs? In a sense, both. Well, when you say more exposure time, basically the exposure time of the individual sub, we're going to kind of take a rule of thumb of that as we want to separate the histogram from the left side. And once it's separated, that's kind of enough. And once you get there, find out what that exposure time is, and then take lots and lots and lots of those subs. My thought is doing that method, it's kind of the same thing. Is it more exposure time or is it more subs? Of course, saying more overall exposure time. Exposing a single image longer isn't going to change much once you separate the histogram from the left side of the image. Hope that makes sense. So that's it for tonight. I do not yet have a presenter for next week. I'm going to try and get something together. Otherwise, we'll do these open sessions. I hate the way that the title is open session, but when you guys see them, just know if you want to have, if you have some questions ready, keep it up. If you, yep.
Adam, before we go, I just wanted to remind everybody that Nightfall is coming up in early November, and we've got a different way to do the presentations this time. Instead of having one speaker come out and spend all day at the workshop, we're going to have 4 different speakers. I'm going to be one of them, talking about how to get more out of your processing. And then we're going to have Danny Perry's going to be talking about when you go camping and taking pictures when you're camping, how to handle your power supplies and stuff like that. Greg Beneke is going to be talking about how to get into astroimaging and some things he's learned in his journey through astroimaging. The kinds of things, we always have a very good show on the Astroimaging channel when somebody's talking about the things they've learned and which things made big differences and stuff like that. And then the 4th presenter is going to be Tom Bash, and Tom's going to be talking about high resolution astroimaging
for lunar and solar and planetary. So if you go to the Nightfall website, for those of you who don't know what Nightfall is, it's a star party out in Borrego Springs, California, under exceptionally dark skies. And it's at a RV resort. So unlike most star parties, people are actually going to be taking showers and hanging around in the spa, and there's a bar at the hotel and stuff like that. So it's kind of a luxury star party. Anyway, that's coming up in early November. And I think Warren wanted to remind everybody, Warren Keller and Ron Bretcher are doing their 3-day Pix Insight workshops. And you can go to the website for Ron Bretcher, for Warren Keller there, and get information. And late September, one of them's in Tucson, and the one the next week after that, and at the HOTEC, or at the HUTEC offices. I got them confused. At the HUTEC offices in Orange County, and they're expensive, yeah. But they're pretty good investments. I mean, you spend a lot of money on software and everything else, hardware, and it's sometimes good to sit down with people. There'll be sessions on actually working with your data. You bring your data, and they'll actually work with you on that, as well as a lot of tips and tricks for Pix Insight. They're both Pix Insight work. That's Nightfall website and Warren Keller's website. Both of those are coming up in September for Keller and Bretcher, and then November for Nightfall. Thanks for letting me mention that.
No problem. Thank you, Alex. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Keep an eye out. I see the suggestion on a show about batteries. Got to find someone who knows something about batteries. But yeah, Life Pose. I want them too, just very, very expensive. I'll see what I can come up with. Thanks, guys. Have a good night. Have a good week. Clear skies.